Welcome to the explosive finale of Robert Hendy-Freegard's reign as the puppet master. Last time, we saw him rob families, blind and control victims like Kim Adams and Sarah Smith. Now, in part 4, it's game over, starting with a sting at Heathrow Airport, a helicopter chase in France, and a trial that should have ended him for good, or did it? This is the craziest chapter yet. Hit that like button and let's watch this con artist fall. Kim's mother told him that Robert had said Kim was waiting in the car in the parking lot, and that after leaving the coffee shop, they were supposed to go there. Detective Bob responded, "All right, we're with you every step of the way. Don't be afraid, we're monitoring everything and have the situation under control. Go with him to the car." Kim's mother left the bathroom and returned to Robert, then headed with him toward the parking lot. The police and agents present were waiting for the moment they could locate Kim, as this was crucial before confronting Robert. When Kim's mother and Robert reached the parking lot, the surveillance team identified their car and immediately noticed a woman waiting inside. Once they confirmed this was likely Kim, Detective Bob gave orders to the arrest team to move in. Suddenly, the area was swarming with undercover security officers and agents who seemed to emerge from nowhere. Robert was arrested, and Kim and her mother were secured. Detective Bob was the first to interview Robert in the interrogation room. He tried asking many questions about his relationship with Kim, his lies about spy training and tests, and his claims about working for security services, but Robert's consistent response was no comment. The detective asked about John, Maria, Sarah, and what he had done to them over the past 10 years, but he denied everything. When asked about what happened to Sarah Smith and her whereabouts, he refused to cooperate and denied all charges. When police searched Robert after his arrest, they found 2 important items in his pocket. The first was a card with the name Ronnie and a phone number underneath. Keep this card in mind, as it will be important later. The second significant item was a set of keys belonging to a hotel room at the Buffalo Hotel in France. They went to this hotel, located in the French Alps, found the room he had been staying in, and entered it. Inside, they discovered all his belongings: extremely expensive watches, designer shoes, and a locked travel bag. When they opened this bag, they found a treasure trove of important documents that would help them with the case. Inside the bag were passports, letters, receipts, credit cards, and even driver's licenses belonging to different women. There were additional identities beyond the victims they already knew about, including Elizabeth Bartholomew, Leslie Gardner, and Renata Kester. These 3 were also among Robert's victims, all of whom he had targeted over the past years. Throughout this time, he had been managing a large number of victims simultaneously. How he divided his time between all these victims, only God knows. Some he was engaged to, others he was deceiving, each with her own story. I'll briefly tell you the story of one victim, Elizabeth Bartholomew, because her story reveals this man's cruelty. Elizabeth's story began in 1996. She had just gotten married, yet Robert managed to seduce her and entered into an illicit relationship with her behind her husband's back. He then began threatening to send compromising photos to her husband and continuously extorted money from her. He convinced her to leave her husband, promising marriage, and made her change her name, phone number, and everything about herself to run away with him. He made her cut ties with everyone she knew and leave her past behind, just as he did with his other victims. After she fled with him, he made her take out bank loans in her name, telling her they would use the money for their wedding and to start their new life together. Of course, he took this money and she never saw it again. In the end, he kept leaving her in cheap hotels without money, contact, or sometimes even food, disappearing for weeks while she had to fend for herself. Once, he even abandoned her in a London park with no money, no food, and nowhere to go. According to her testimony, she was forced to survive on Mars chocolate bars for an entire week. Robert didn't just fail to marry her, he turned her entire life into hell. Some might say she deserved it for cheating on her husband and allowing Robert to manipulate her, but it should be clear by now that this wasn't an ordinary con man. He clearly had persuasion and manipulation abilities beyond our imagination, and perhaps his most important ability, as we mentioned, was his capacity to choose suitable victims he knew he could control. This is Elizabeth Bartholomew's story in brief, which also took place over several years. Elizabeth suffered the most and was the most destroyed by Robert. The other victims' stories followed a similar pattern, even if the details varied slightly. Sarah was also among the victims who suffered greatly, and she was the one who remained under Robert's control the longest 10 years. Even Maria, who, as I told you, married Robert and had 2 daughters with him, eventually managed to escape. Their relationship had always been difficult and full of problems, and in the end, she discovered he had several relationships with other women who were actually his victims. She separated from him, took her daughters, and went to live with her parents. So even Maria left before Sarah did. Sarah lived in constant suffering throughout the past 10 years, and Robert never failed to oppress her. He would leave her in the worst conditions, always taking any money she earned from her fast food restaurant job and making her live on minimal food. She had no friends, no family, not even an identity. All she did in life was follow Robert's instructions, and he kept moving her to different places periodically, all under the same deception that the IRA was still targeting her. Even when moving her to another location, he would cover her head with a bag, claiming these were security precautions. The whole purpose of these actions was to break his victim, to control and dominate her more. Once, he made her stay in one of what he called safe houses, supposedly used by intelligence agencies, made her enter a bathroom, and told her not to leave. He didn't lock the door or force her to stay in the bathroom, he simply told her to stay there and not come out because there would be great danger if she did. Then he closed the door without locking it and left her alone in that bathroom for days without food or anything. As we said, these techniques helped him control his victims, paralyzing their minds. When Robert returned to Sarah after several days and let her out of the bathroom, giving her some food, he made her feel as if he was her savior, her safe haven, even though he was the one who put her in the bathroom. After this experience, he asked if she wanted to be his girlfriend, and Sarah, whose mind was completely paralyzed and brainwashed, agreed. He did all this to gain control over her with her own will and consent. He literally managed to destroy everything in her every ounce of will and consciousness. After Sarah's father told Detective Bob her story, he tried to find Sarah, but there was no trace of her. As we mentioned, Robert always made his victims use fake names to the point where they would forget their real names and identities. She had no phone number, no address, no bank account, no government transactions. Robert made her live like a ghost with no existence. Now, even after Robert was finally arrested, he still refused to tell them where Sarah was and refused to cooperate at all, denying all charges against him. But if you remember, I told you that one of the things they found in his pocket after his arrest was this card with the name Ronnie and a phone number underneath. Ronnie was actually Renata Kester, who was also one of Robert's victims. The police identified her through her passport and civil ID card found inside Robert's bag at the hotel in the French Alps. So the police called this Renata and asked if she knew Robert, but Robert had previously told her that if anyone asked about him, she should deny knowing him. So Ronnie hesitated and initially refused to cooperate with the police. However, Detective Bob told her they had found her passport and identity documents in Robert's bag, so they knew there was a connection between them. He gently encouraged her to come to the station and cooperate with them. Ronnie agreed and came to the station, where she told them her story with Robert. She said she met him in 2000 at a car show where she bought a car from him. Afterward, they developed an intermittent relationship during which he managed to take about £200,000 from her. He told her the same story, that he was a spy in the security service and that the government would return this money to her, the same usual lie. Renata also told them that Robert had contacted her a few months ago after a long period of no contact. He told her he had a poor woman who needed shelter or a place to stay for a while, and convinced her that this woman could help with housework and cleaning, essentially becoming her housekeeper. Renata agreed to take her in. This woman was currently working as her house cleaner and living with her. She told them the woman's name was Carrie and showed them a photo she had taken herself of this woman. As soon as Detective Bob saw the photo, he immediately sensed this was Sarah. The resemblance was very strong. Detective Bob went with Renata to her house to meet this woman, and indeed, as soon as she opened the door, he knew it was Sarah. The first words that came from his mouth were, "Hello, Sarah." Sarah was shocked and began trembling. It had been years since she'd heard that name. It was like the name of another person from her past. The detective tried to calm her and began explaining that everything had been a deception, that Robert wasn't a spy or security service agent, but just a con man who had been arrested, and everything he had told her was a lie from the beginning. Finally, the detective told Sarah she would come with him. Sarah was in such a state of shock, her head spinning, unable to comprehend anything, barely able to stand on her feet. Eventually, Detective Bob took her to the police station, where he tried to calm her further and began explaining Robert's crimes and the number of his victims, and how he had conned all these people. Of course, this was the shock of her life. It was like suddenly waking from a nightmare. But after what? She had lost her future, her education, her job, and most importantly, her family and friends, all for nothing. She had suffered alone for 10 years without any purpose, 10 years of fear, terror, pain, torment, and hunger. Also, this con man could steal some money from her and her family. The police then called her family, and her father and mother came. Despite everything that had happened, they immediately embraced her. Their joy was indescribable. After Sarah's return to her family, the police continued their investigation of the case and found the other victims, like Elizabeth Bartholomew, whom we talked about before, and another woman named Leslie Gardner. They believe there were other victims they know nothing about. For example, they found a Brazilian woman's identity in his bag at the hotel, but they couldn't reach her or find out anything about her. Besides the minor victims who might be everywhere, at least they found the main victims. This case continued to build for 3 years, with Robert in custody and prison throughout this period. In 2005, he was put on trial. They gathered all the evidence they had found, and several victims testified against him. He was charged with kidnapping, theft, and fraud, and they determined that the total amount of money he had managed to take reached £1 million. However, Robert continued to deny all charges in court and even tried to twist the facts and throw accusations at his victims, making up false stories about them. For example, he claimed that John was the real fraudster who had lured him and had AIDS due to his deviant practices. He said that Maria, who was his wife, had treated their daughters badly and was wasteful, spending money recklessly. He said Elizabeth was the one who cheated on her husband and pursued him for a relationship. As for Kim, the American who was his fiancée, he claimed she had cheated on him with 4 men and manipulated him, pretending to love him to take his money. The fool was trying to reverse the roles and make them appear to be the con artists who had deceived him, throwing out stories and lies with complete confidence in front of the court, despite all the evidence against him and all the victims testifying against him. Finally, after the trial sessions continued for several months, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, the minimum sentence possible for someone like this, a dangerous criminal who destroys people's lives. He should never leave prison. The story should have ended here, but we all know the story I told you at the beginning of the video, which happened in 2012, meaning that Robert Hendy-Freegard would get out of prison. But how? What happened was that in 2007, Robert and his lawyers filed an appeal with the Court of Appeal, which reviews cases and sentences. The main defense used by the lawyers was that none of the victims were kidnapped. They had the freedom to leave at any time they wanted. The court agreed that the victims weren't physically restrained, so they dropped the kidnapping charges against all victims except Maria, his former wife. But the biggest charge was kidnapping, which had given him the life sentence. When the kidnapping charge was dropped, the remaining charges only got him 7 years in prison, and since he had been detained and imprisoned since 2002, he would have served his sentence by 2009. Indeed, in 2009, he was released from prison. Of course, this sentence was a shock to the victims and investigators who had worked on the case. How could someone whose guilt was as clear as the sun and whose crimes had destroyed many people's lives get such a trivial punishment compared to what he had done? But in the end, none of them could do anything. The court's ruling is the law. After Robert Freegard was released from prison in 2009, some people might have imagined he would repent, but someone like this can never repent. This is his way of life now. Now we'll return to the story. We started the video with the story of Mark, Sandra, and their children Jake and Sophie. Robert entered their lives using the name David Hendy and began dating the mother, Sandra. He managed to control and manipulate her with his malicious methods, then split up the family, making the son Jake leave the house and isolating the mother and daughter Sophie. Sophie was also manipulated by Robert, who drained all her money. And then, as we said, Sophie left the house and reunited with her father and brother. As for Robert and Sandra, they disappeared from the house. Now Mark was able to discover through his research that this person who called himself David was actually the dangerous, convicted con man Robert Freegard. After Mark discovered Robert's true identity and told them what had happened to them over the past years, the police listened to his story but initially weren't interested in pursuing the case. But Mark kept insisting, visiting multiple times and going to different departments, and finally, after several attempts, they agreed to investigate the case. This was in 2015, and they began looking for the mother, Sandra, as a missing person. They actually managed to locate her, and she was still living with Robert. The police went to her and told her the truth about this man, that he was a con man who had been convicted and imprisoned before, that he had a criminal record, and that he was a dangerous and even mentally disturbed person. They asked her, "Do you know this man? Do you know what he's done?" Her response was, "Yes, I know, and I'm staying with him by my choice." The police offered to take her under their protection and separate her from him, but she refused and said she wanted to stay with him. Imagine to what degree he had manipulated her. The police had no choice but to leave her with him. It was her will, and she chose this with her complete freedom. When Mark and the children received this news from the police that their mother Sandra had decided to stay with Robert despite knowing his truth, they were shocked and couldn't understand how he could control her to this degree. Years passed, and the mother was still with Robert. There were occasional communications between her and her children. Maybe once or twice a year she would call them randomly from an unknown number. But even when they talked to her, they felt like they were talking to a stranger, like this wasn't their mother. Then even their grandparents, Sandra's father and mother, died, and imagine, she didn't attend either of their funerals. We reached 2020, and after the grandparents' death, Sandra was supposed to inherit their house, worth £300,000. Her son Jake decided to try to put the house under his guardianship because he knew Robert would try to take control of it through his mother. Imagine that the mother filed a lawsuit against her son to reclaim the house she was supposed to inherit from her parents, whose funerals she hadn't even attended. This case was during the COVID period, so court sessions were held through video calls online. This was the first time Jake had seen his mother in 7 years, through court sessions and via video call. Throughout the case, the mother insisted on accusing her son of theft, saying he had always stolen from her, even though all Jake was trying to do was protect the house and prevent Robert from stealing it. Jake tried to explain his position to the judge and explain that his mother was being manipulated by this person named Robert, who was convicted and had previous cases. In the end, although the judge was inclined to side with the son, especially after hearing all these details, by law, he had to give the house to the mother as she was the legal owner. According to People's investigations and news reports, Robert and Sandra were living in France during that period, and Robert had started working in the purebred dog business, especially Beagle dogs. There were even warnings issued by some people on Reddit to the Beagle breeding community. Here, for example, they posted a photo with a warning to Beagle breeders about the dangerous serial con man, Robert Hendy-Freegard, who also uses the name David Clifton and is known as the Blood Master, participating in Beagle shows. This was a warning to be careful of this known con man who was currently working in the dog selling business. It was clear that Robert was continuing his con operations. They interviewed a woman who didn't reveal her name or face. This woman was a Beagle breeder, according to her account. Robert contacted her under the name David Clifton, claiming to be a Beagle expert who could help improve the quality of her dogs. She began dealing with him, and Robert, or David, as she knew him, started selling her dogs from France. She would transfer money to him for these dogs, but here's where the scam occurred. It was in the dogs' medical costs. Robert would constantly defraud her by making her pay certain costs that were supposedly for veterinary care, vaccinations, and other health-related matters. This woman became one of Robert's most recent victims in 2021, and it seems Robert was always looking for new victims. A Reddit user wrote this comment saying, "This scammer was about to con my friend's parents. He tried to sell them a Beagle in a very strange way." He acted very emotionally and told them he was in a very difficult situation. He lied about having cancer, financial problems, needing money for treatment, and being in dire straits. People started knowing more about him, and his name became infamous, especially after several documentaries and news reports about him came out. The question is, where is Robert now? According to news websites and information I found about him, in August 2022, French police were investigating a report about someone breeding and selling beagles using illegal methods in scam operations. This person was Robert. When the police tried to approach and question him, he fled in an Audi he owned. I'm not sure if this was the same Audi that Sandra had or not. During this escape attempt, he ran over 2 police officers, seriously injuring one of them. This incident prompted French police to mobilize a large number of forces to pursue Robert, including 2 helicopters participating in the chase and search operations. Sandra was detained by police and questioned as his alleged accomplice. This is a recent photo of Sandra from 2022 walking one of the Beagles. After police questioned Sandra, she cooperated with them and helped identify possible locations where Robert might go. Robert remained on the run for several days, and there was an alert out for him not just in France, but across Europe, as their borders are open. His intentional injury of police officers while fleeing made him a high-priority wanted person. Indeed, 8 days after the police-running incident, he was arrested in Belgium at one of the checkpoints. This happened in September 2022, and in October, Belgian authorities handed him over to French authorities for trial. Robert appears to still be in French prisons, and a final verdict hasn't been issued yet. His case is still under investigation, and it seems they're building a comprehensive case against him because, according to news reports, he faces more than 30 charges. Beyond the fraud and scam charges, attempted murder of police officers has been added to the list. God willing, we hope these charges will keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. As for Sandra, there's honestly no news about her, and I don't know if she returned to her family or not. With this, we've basically concluded our story, one of the strangest stories I've encountered, and the most complex and longest story I've covered on the channel. I know the story is crazy and has many unbelievable elements, but as I told you, there are many sources, all confirming these events. Anyone who wants to verify can do so. The internet is open, and they'll find a sea of information and sources. I still, like you, can't comprehend how he managed to deceive his victims for all these long years, especially the students. How did he convince them for 10 years that they were being hunted, harming them and their families and stealing their money, yet they didn't suspect anything except for the unbelievable spy lie in the first place? In the end, I feel most people and even judges will consider them just stupid and naive, and there might be some truth to that. Certainly, Robert Freegard didn't choose his victims without studying them first and knowing they had weaknesses and a level of naivety he could exploit. But surely the bigger factor was his ability to deceive and manipulate, because his victims weren't just 1 or 2. We saw how many victims he managed to manipulate. Certainly, it happened gradually, not overnight. Long years, and there's also something called accumulated loss when the first lie works on the victim, and they lose a certain amount or suffer a certain loss. The victim keeps chasing the same lie. Even if the lie grows bigger, and the losses increase, and things reach an unbelievable level, the victim continues on the same path, hoping everything will turn out to be true and genuine in the end, justifying all the sacrifices and losses that came before. It's like someone who gambles when they lose a little. They keep gambling hoping to recover their losses. The victim is in a psychological state that keeps them stuck in the same cycle, unwilling to leave because if they suddenly left the cycle, they'd realize everything that happened was for nothing, and all the losses, pain, suffering, and time spent had no value to begin with. This would completely destroy them. So the mind and psyche, to protect their owner, keep them living and continuing in the same lie, even if they don't believe it or have doubts. The brain continues to suppress and bury these doubts. I don't know, looks like I turned into a psychologist at the end. And by the way, everything I said is just my own analysis, whether it's right or wrong, God knows. You too can share and write your analysis of what happened in the comments below. Finally, if you liked the story, as usual, Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive new content first. Here are also some previous amazing stories you can enjoy. Thank you for following. See you in the next video. Goodbye.